Today we have a showdown between open source tools and proprietary tools. What do we use, when do we use them, and why do we use them? Open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. We're going to share some examples of open source tools that we've used. There's that ding. How long can we go without mentioning Drupal this afternoon?
Yeah, exactly.
We're right into it. Being open source, it's the main candidate for open source tools, but there are a few others.
Well, yeah, I mean, when it comes to open source tools, as you mentioned, Drupal's number one. Pretty much every application that Drupal relies on is open source. Well, you can get proprietary databases. I understand that. Generally, the database, the server that it's running on, the web server, PHP, all of that stuff is open source, or the web stack, essentially. When you think about it, jQuery, well, I'm showing my age now with jQuery. But no, jQuery 4 was released, I think, or like a beta version of that, so it's made a resurgence.
Yeah, they just did a rejig of jQuery and released a whole new one. Which it's interesting to learn that jQuery and React are almost the same age. There's like 4 years difference.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Then also all of the, modern web technology is open source as well. So you can't deny just how important open source is, especially in the web space. If I want to talk about my own applications, just to kind of broaden it a bit, anyone who does web development understands that, most of it is open source, unless you're using like an Oracle database. Microsoft SQL, they're the only ones I can really think of. A few, and I did create a list of this because I had to kind of prepare. A few open source software that I use is OBS. So that's for recording video. So right now I am recording my screen and also live. I use OBS for live streaming. I'm not live streaming this podcast right now. Maybe in the future we will. All of the live streams that I do go through OBS, but also OBS can be used to record your screen as well. So there's a little top tip for everyone. If you don't want to pay for Camtasia or do any screen recording, just use OBS because it is free. The other piece of software I use a fair bit. Exactly.
That's exactly it is. Game streamer, OBS is up there.
Yes, absolutely. The other piece of software that I use is called Obsidian, and that's for note taking. And that is open source as well. Then it's the standard VS Code, so VSC, Homebrew. I think Homebrew, it's a packaging manager, right? So it is technically
Homebrew itself, and probably pretty much everything that Homebrew offers.
Yes, well, everything in that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I also use a database management tool called SQL Ace, and that's a Mac only one. That's just a GUI for accessing MariaDB, MySQL. Then it's a standard Vim, Git, LibreOffice. Okay, occasionally I do have that. I think I do have that installed.
Yeah.
One that I use to learn a second language is called Anki. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that.
Yeah, we discussed that. We brought that up with the.
We have, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the spatial repetition learning.
Space.
Yeah, space repetition. So Anki is it's not really focused on development, but you can install it and you can give you like flashcards, and it gives you a pretty complex UI for it. And the last one, which I just recently discovered, and that is called FreeTube, and that is a Vue.js application that you run on Mac, Linux, and Windows. And it is a privacy first client for YouTube. So essentially, you can watch YouTube without ads, because recently, I don't know if I should be saying this, putting this on YouTube, but recently, YouTube was pretty aggressive with stopping people from accessing the YouTube site with uBlock Origin. Well, there you go. There's another. Isn't uBlock Origin also open source?
Possibly.
Yeah.
As you go through this, I'm sort of becoming aware myself to an extent how much open source infiltrates. It's funny, it's really hitting me now as we discuss this. Here I listed off a few tools. I mean, I had Drupal, WordPress, Apache as the web server along with Nginx.
Yeah.
Same as you, MySQL, and then Postgres SQL being ones, Git, Apache, Node.js, PHP, jQuery, Bootstrap, Docker, LibreOffice, There's like Nextcloud, GitLab, and then we've discussed them last week, like GIMP, Inkscape, OBS, VS Code, like Vim on the command line. But so many of those come with Linux pre-installed. Like Vim's Classic always comes with Linux anyway. But then as you discuss it, there's things like OBS and Blender funnily get out of the open source hobbyist realm. I think a lot of people are open source people who like to use open source stuff, but then every once in a while, one of them becomes mainstream, like OBS and Blender, and that's just what you use.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting that, most of the internet runs on Linux. Most people watching this podcast would be familiar with Linux, and a lot of the tools we're talking about. But then just to realize when you say things like uBlock Origin, is that open source? Kind of so many things you just install, you don't even question it. They might not even know.
Yeah, for people who don't know, uBlock Origin is a extension for Chrome, and I think it's also Firefox that blocks ads. That's what it essentially does. Okay, there is a GitHub account. Doesn't mean it's open. A GPL v3. Yeah, it's open source.
See, most of the stuff on GitHub is open source generally. Probably just a lot of non-licensed stuff. That's interesting. Probably a thing to bring up in open source, that it's kind of got a pretty specific definition of it's got to meet certain requirements. Not all open licenses, like the
just because it's on
software.
But just because it's on GitHub doesn't mean it's fully open source. You can select a standard license for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when we're discussing open source, because things like I mentioned GitLab, for example, where GitLab comes with it's kind of in that grey area where you've got the GitLab Community Edition is licensed under a permissive open source license, but then if you want some of the proprietary extras, pay for those, and they're proprietary. So it's a bit of a hybrid model. But then Redis, the controversy over that's just gone proprietary, and it's like that's a big can of worms, in my opinion. And it's happened before. There's a piece of software called Wappalizer that you can run against a website, and I'll tell you what, it sort of analyzes a website to figure out what technologies it runs on, whether it be Apache and PHP, whether it's built with Drupal. It just kind of looks at the output of the HTML to figure that out. That in the last few years went proprietary. It's funny that people forked it. As soon as they got wind of that's what's happening, they forked it very quickly. But it's interesting. It's the legalities around taking an open source software with so many people's contributions and then going, no, we're closed sourcing it now. It's like, well, it's not yours.
Well, that's it. Absolutely. Because I always thought that you need approval from all the contributors, and it needs to be I would assume approved. I remember somewhere, I think it was React, when React changed its license, because do you remember React used to be under some random Facebook license, and I think it was Gutenberg, the Gutenberg editor for WordPress. Want to use React because it was some funny Facebook license, and they were like, well, we don't want Facebook to own it. This was before Meta was called what was it? No, Facebook was called Facebook and not Meta.
Yep.
And then React changed its license to like MIT. Let me just double check that. Is React like React Git? And then that kind of just set it like into the stratosphere of just the adoption of React. Yes, React is MIT. That's kind of like the standard.
So it wasn't. It was what you're saying. It was a closed source project. And
No. It wasn't closed source, but it was a interesting.
A weird Facebook license.
It was a weird Facebook license, and I do remember that it was, here we go, 11 years ago, the first license. Oh, I'm not even going to bother trying to search for years. 11 years ago. Oh no, it was Apache. It was Apache too, but I do remember that. Yeah, there was concern about it. Yeah, it was a BSD license, but it was like a heavily modified one that, Facebook could do random things. And then they pushed it to be MIT. And then once it was MIT, that kind of sorted everything else out. And I do know in the WordPress community, when they were deciding on Vue or React to power the Gutenberg editor, for people who don't know, the Gutenberg editor in WordPress is the one where you go / and it's got that fancy editor. Which you can install on Drupal, by the way.
Ding, Drupal.
Ding, there's go. We should actually have a drinking game and take a shot every single time we mention Drupal. And I do remember that, once it was relicensed, they just went with React. It can be changed for the good. I think projects can go from a restrictive license into a more unrestricted license that is for the better. Absolutely. And I do think that now, when it comes to front-end tech, so a lot of these libraries that are written for React components, views and Vue and things like that, you want it to be MIT. I think that kind of sorts out any legal issues where you can use it on any type of product. It's when it's not MIT, then it's like, okay, yeah.
ECC are some of the things I've never dug into very much. You know, I've been...
Well, you haven't had these conversations at the pub with other developers?
Well, I've had the conversations before, but when you're sitting down and really getting your head around each individual license, and that's you know, being a web developer, you often just feet on the ground. You come into a project, they go, hey, you know, you're hired as a Drupal developer. We're building this project with Drupal.
Yeah.
You kind of go, all right, well, you've decided to use Drupal. I'm sitting here using my Linux box, my Ubuntu box. I know they're all open source. Not very often you come across a product where, especially myself, I'm not being in the hot seat where it's my decision to go, hey, is this license permissive? Usually the tools that we're using have been discussed by someone else in the chain. So I've never really dug into the licensing of it, right? So that's, I'm aware that there are different licenses and they give you different levels of what you can do with the code and what you can't and where you can use it. But that comes into our next part of the discussion, is discussing the benefits of open source tools, things like community support, flexibility and cost effectiveness. But then it's also what are the legalities around? I mean, obviously proprietary stuff, it's easy. You can't use it, right? Unless you pay.
Yeah, exactly.
Generally,
absolutely.
it might be service based, or I mean, these are the things in proprietary like that. You used to be able to like download a piece of software, you pay it, now you own it, you use it, and then they changed it. How do they describe it? You don't own it, you've just paid for the right to use it. So we actually own it, and then now everything's going service based, especially with all these AI tools coming along. Kind of like they're all $20 a month each, so you're like, that's like thousands of dollars to use all these tool chain. I mean, that's what we're talking about, how much of the AI stuff is open source too. But we're sort of going all over the place with a little bit because open source is everywhere and there's so much to discuss and talk about. It's amazing how far it's everywhere like that. Talking about the benefits, you and I have both built a career on it to some extent. We learned Drupal. I mean, that's interesting because I know my story of how I got into open source. Like even when I was like a teenager, 14, I got introduced to Linux. I started setting up Linux. And of course, I was a bit interested back then. I want to learn client server architectures and how to set up a network and how to set up a server. And you're like, so Microsoft NT's out, you go and search the internet, Alta Vista back then, and you search how to set up an NT. How much does it cost? And it's like $2,500. You're like, well, you know, I'm 15. I don't have $2,500, and it's like, so your mate goes, hey, you can install Linux back in the Slackware days. And it was very nerdy, I guess, got into using Linux. And it's like, hey, I can do all this cool stuff for free. And I remember thinking back then, why on earth would you be using? And then suddenly this fight's getting hired to work at an ISP. That's all running on Linux. The whole software is running on Linux. Got hired as web developer a few places where they give you a Windows machine and you just go, can I put Linux on it, please? One day you just go and install Linux on it and use it for a month without anybody being any of the wiser. And then one day your boss walks in and goes, hey, have you got Linux? I'll change it back. And you're like, why? And you go, because all the problem. And you're like, it's been there for 2 months. No one's noticed. But then, so that was pretty much my journey. I just got onto Linux because it was a cost thing. It's like I can just do so much more with my computer. I can run Bash. There's lots to learn. It was a big thing to explore and play with. One thing I've said a lot growing up, sort of on a 5-acre farm out in the country, 100 acres next door. Growing up as a kid, when I used to want to make stuff, I'd just go out in the paddock and find wire and wood and nails and hammers and put things together. And as I got older, I started playing with computers. And it's like, you want to build things. And if I've got to pull my credit card out every time I want to try and see if a part fits, I just can't do it. And I ended up in the open source world and really caring about it from that, being quite advocate for it. But I really don't like Microsoft. Especially nowadays, you see like Microsoft's getting sued all the time over and over and over again. The same with Apple, gets sued over and over again. I mean, they're in the media again now. But, both of them getting sued by governments and stuff, which just it amazes me that on one hand, the government's opening lawsuits against them for their anti-competitive practices, at the same time mandating that you use them on all their desktops. And it gets me a bit, like when you've got a government that's on one hand trying to get them for their bad practices, on the other hand getting all their staff to use them. So there's been experience. I've heard that certain governments, I think the German government at one point went open source everywhere, Linux on the desktop. I don't know what ever happened. That's a rumor I heard quite a while back. Years back, 10, 15 years ago. But it's just interesting how that's sort of my story with the open source. I'm just kind of like, hey, it's everywhere. I use it. And I get quite, especially with phones and stuff now where there's not a lot of option. Like one of the reasons I used open source, because it was cost effective. And I've got to admit that the big part of it was it being cost effective. But now if I'm on a Linux phone, they don't have the competitive advantage that Google and Apple have. You want to get an Android phone, you've got to go to Samsung or someone, all the privacy issues that come along with that, but you get your phone cheap in comparison to what you pay for a Linux one. And then you get the Linux one, and this is one of the challenges you get with open source all the time. You go and buy your Linux phone, and now there's no Facebook app, there's no YouTube app, there's no, right? It's totally capable of running apps, just not running the same ones, and nobody's writing those apps for it. Linux suffered the same thing for years. The big culprit I saw on Linux was Adobe. And I've done that so many times that, being in a workplace and, you just, I need to, it used to be Internet Explorer and Adobe, but then Internet Explorer finally went away. You're like, great, but then Adobe's still the holdout. And now Adobe's mostly online anyway, right? I don't use it, right? Because I've always used GIMP when I need to do graphics.
You still have, well, if you want to use Auditions or for audio engineering or a Premiere Pro, they're applications.
Yeah, right. So that's where I avoid. That's one we didn't mention, KDN Live, right? As a video editor.
There you go.
I mean, we'll bring that up because that's what I use to edit this podcast.
Oh, Audacity. What is it? Audacity? Wait,
Audacity is a very popular.
Yeah.
If you look up anything about editing audio, Audacity's the go, right?
That was I used that to edit audio when I first started doing video.
Yep.
There you go.
I know I've recorded some music and used the open source Ardour. Is that how you pronounce it? ARDOUR.
Oh, okay.
I use that to mix my audio. That's quite popular. So it's funny. There's so many open source touches into every single place, but the challenges are, one hand, see something like Drupal. You use Drupal because you get all that community support. It's almost like free support, right? You need some help. There are forums, there are communities, there's places you go. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to hand over your credit card. There are people just willing to give their time and help you out for free because they use Drupal. And it's got almost that lovely, nice. I mean, we didn't talk about it. You have just been at Drupal South, where first time I went and saw that, and I just, as a community event, like here's a room full of direct competitors all coming and teaching each other how to run their business, like effectively run their businesses better, because they're all Drupal businesses and they're all sharing, and their staff are sharing and supporting each other and patting each other on the back. And it's like, what an amazing community. And that sense of, you don't get community like that so much around proprietary things, and that's where, I get my hackles up with things like Discord. We used to use IRC. I think there was a big reason a lot of gamers got into Discord, and I don't understand the technicalities of it. There was some sort of private security reason they didn't want to use IRC. And Discord was the only thing that provided that. But now everybody's using it for all sorts of stuff. And it's like, but, why are you letting this company make all this money when there are open source alternatives? It's just,
I guess I shouldn't bring up the fact that maybe we should have a Discord channel for this podcast.
We've discussed that. I mentioned this in another one. That's part of this conversation between open source versus proprietary. Me being such a stick in the mud for proprietary stuff, I coded in Vim for years and years and years until, ironically, working for what was an open source advocacy company. But then we had the Australian version of that and the New Zealand one. The New Zealand directors were kind of like, no, we're an open source organization. We want you to use open source tools. So no PHP Storm, right? But then Australia, we were kind of our own entity with our own ideas, and we had a client that was like, no, we don't want you using Vim. don't know how it came down the line, but the client's gone, no, we want you to use a proper IDE. Like, so I got pushed to go, like, the client doesn't want you to use Vim anymore. You have to use PHP Storm. So I made the switch, installed my Vim bindings, and I was kind of happy. I was comfortable.
Yeah.
I sort of never went back too, right? I started using PHP Storm, and this is part of me growing up with open source so much. You like what you know, and I'm familiar with all the open source tools. Now I'm familiar with PHP Storm. I want to make the switch to VS Code, and I find VS Code absolutely, like, I kind of, the learning curve's so big. And here we come to the good example with something like you mentioned prior to this, NeoVim, right? And that's what I want. I kind of like, well, I prefer, if I'm going to change out of PHP Storm, I'll go and use NeoVim, because NeoVim, Vim on steroids, much better designed for coding. I know people that use it extensively. Go and watch the Primeagen and stuff on YouTube. He uses NeoVim, I think, himself. But then when you come into Drupal, PHP Storm and VS Code have all these plugins written to help you out, and then NeoVim doesn't have any. I'd have to write them all myself. It's like, great. And that's and that's where I bring this up a lot. Often the problem with using some of these niche tools is that, in my opinion, they're better tools for all sorts of reasons we've already discussed. VS Code is open source. PHP Storm's the interesting one, where I go, you're paying to use PHP Storm, and then somebody wants to extend it, so they write a plugin and they open source the plugin for a proprietary platform. And I'm just like, if you needed to extend the IDE to customize it to do what you wanted and use its API, and you wrote a plugin and you open source the plugin, why didn't you just use VS Code? I don't know.
Yeah.
There are sort of things, while you're writing open source plugins for a proprietary tool, you're just making money for somebody for that I find interesting sometimes. Writing an open source plugin for a proprietary tool, you're benefiting the owners of that tool. They're not paying you anything, and they're making money off it. Like, you're working. I find that a little bit odd.
I mean, I can give my quick origin story when it comes to open source, because it's similar to yours. And that was, I originally started using Linux. So I remember when I was in high school, around, what was it? I was in high school 97, 98, 99.
Giving you age.
And I purchased the Linux Australia magazine that came with a copy of Red Hat when Red Hat was free, when it wasn't enterprise only.
Is that Fedora?
Well, it's Fedora now, but it used to be Red Hat. It used to be Red Hat.
It's just Red Hat.
It was like Red Hat 5 or something. Like 6 possibly, I don't know, but it used to be Red Hat, and I would install that on my Pentium 233, and I think I had only 64 meg of RAM, because I wanted to play Quake 3 and I had to get 64 meg of RAM. That was important for that. And then I would set up, so I was still on Windows probably 95, 98, or maybe ME, I don't know, who knows. And I used to hate Windows. I was always like, Windows is the worst. Microsoft is the worst. I'm going to use Linux.
Yeah.
But, I could use it, but I was sharing back then. We only had one computer, and that was a family computer.
Yeah.
And then, I would dual boot, and then I'd have to dual boot in. And I remember just playing. Yeah. And I do remember, dual booting, got everything in there. But one thing that just came to me now, Red Hat used to have like an app store very early on where you could download games. And I remember my mum playing and discovering these games. And because back then I was using either KDE or GNOME, maybe GNOME. I think I was more of a GNOME user. And she discovered all these games, and she would just play them because they were all free.
Yep.
And that's one thing. Yeah, when I actually think about it, even Ubuntu, and I use Ubuntu heavily, like 8.04, that had app stores before there were app stores, where you just log in and you just go in there and download. And it was as simple as, it still does, but I mean, that was a precursor before all the app stores, were a thing. But you could go in there, you could search for stuff. And so then I wanted to play games. So that's why I stuck to Windows.
Yeah. that was the story for years. Still
Yeah.
technically is, but it's improved a lot. Which
Yeah. It is. But one thing that kind of got me into, like, really got me into open source, especially once I started to work, early noughties, and that was listening to podcasts. So I used to listen to Lug Radio. I don't know if you remember that. So Lug Radio, it was a bunch of it was based out of it was a bunch of guys from, I think, the UK, and they just talked about all things Linux.
Right. Yeah.
And there was also the Linux Action Show. There was a point where I was listening to that. Yeah, I've been listening to podcasts for a very long time. Maybe I should have started a podcast a long time ago. So that then got me into using Ubuntu. Then I used Ubuntu, and I've probably mentioned this before, but then I got annoyed with using Ubuntu because I wanted to connect the second monitor, and it wasn't as simple as just plugging it in. You had to modify your X11 conf, and then I got annoyed.
Xor.conf file in the
Xor, yeah. Then I wanted to then I just then I went and just bought a Mac, and I've been on Mac ever since. Funnily enough, I did spend a weekend a couple of months ago because I had a spare MacBook Pro, my old 2012 MacBook Pro, and I decided to install the latest Ubuntu on it to see just how difficult it is to install things on it. Yeah, it was a bit of an experience. It's like if you want your Wi-Fi drivers to work, you need to install these Broadcom drivers. If you want your video card to work properly, you need to install these proprietary NVIDIA drivers.
Still, it's NVIDIA drivers. Linux on the desktop still, but it's supposed to be improving recently. There's rumors around that NVIDIA's finally sorting themselves out and giving some like releasing their drivers properly.
Yeah.
But AMD's been on top of that game for forever. You got the dual monitor thing. I don't know when I went through that hump. They just work these days until you start doing things like wanting to use Zoom and screens. You get, there's always been little bits of challenges if you want to do a screencast. That was for a long time. But over the years, everything slowly smooths out. I don't have any problem with dual monitors now, but they're replacing the X server with Wayland now, and that's been while where I'm swapping between one application does what I want in Wayland, the other one does it in X. So then you've got to log out and log back in Wayland. There's often these little issues, but it keeps slowly over time smoothing out more and more and more. I mean, I've found situations like talking about your mother on funding the games on there. I've heard people make the argument for Linux. Oh, but we want to use in an organization things that people know, so we don't have to train them. And it's like, I've literally just sat people down in Linux and said, off you go. And they haven't even noticed. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's where's the browser, and you go there where they see the icon's the same. Click on the same icon. It's like kind of the paradigms are the same. There's a start bar. I mean, you can customize Linux for crazy, but games are getting better. I absolutely love the Steam Deck. They even open source the specs for the case and the whole I love that the open source hardware concept. That's company like Steam's just gone full. Of course, they're trying to get themselves out of Microsoft's thumb. Now, I'm not a fan of Microsoft, right? And that's where being a game thing, Windows has the game market. And why does Windows have the game market? Because of DirectX, right? DirectX is a proprietary API that you can use to access the graphics on your own machine, and all these games wrote it for DirectX. And you want to put it in Linux. Well, there is no DirectX on Linux. You have to totally rewrite that layer, right? And then Valve has come out and done a whole they made Proton, which is a whole translation layer for that system. It's a fork of wine, as far as I understand.
Really?
I probably said a few things that are not technically true. You can correct me on them, but at a oversimplified level, they forked wine. They put all the effort in to build Proton out of it, which basically replaces DirectX, so that you can take a Windows game, just run it on Linux, and oftentimes run faster. Now, we're still getting caught by there's some gaming companies that have their anti-cheats, and the anti-cheats don't work on Linux. It's like, great. There's still always these holdouts where it's not, So now it's like, you can run 95% of your games on Linux. Oh, but what about the other 5%? I'm sticking to Windows. And And I kind of, those arguments have always bothered me a bit. Like that's what you used to hear from Adobe, as far as I understand it, was Adobe was saying, we're not going to put the effort in to put Photoshop on Linux because none of our customers use Linux. Right? And you go, but none of your customers use Linux because your software doesn't run on Linux.
Yeah.
Right? I just never quite understood that argument. It's like kind of, as soon as you write, and then it obviously it costs money and you've got to get developer time and everything on there to port it. But as a Linux advocate, it's like, this is so annoying, right? And, if everybody just bit the bullet for a while and took the pain of learning to use GIMP for a while, right? GIMP would improve so fast, right? And then you're not tied to Adobe anymore. You're out from Adobe's thumb. So that's why I love that Valve's done that. As I understand it, a lot of their motivation was they didn't want to be tied to Microsoft, right? Because all the games they wrote had to run on Linux, and Microsoft could do what they like with DirectX and but now they've got themselves in a position where they're moving out of that. As far as I understand, that's how it works.
Absolutely.
But I'm not really a big gaming person, probably partly because I've always stuck to Linux, and I'm like, well, I don't know, I never really played games that much. Probably why it helped me stick to Linux. But even when Valve brought out the Steam Deck, I was like, I kind of just want to buy one just to say thank you.
Yeah.
Because just to see a big company like Valve come out and put their money where their mouth is. But that's we're talking to. These are some of the challenges, because that's where I've found a lot of issues with sticking to open source before, because often that's, you look at it, you see my avoidance of Discord, and nowadays people are like, if you want help, go into Discord. It's like, I don't have Discord, like kind of, and then you find yourself spending a lot of time and you're just often out on your own a little bit. And that's not the case across the board. Like look at Drupal, for example, it's the exact opposite. But that's one of the challenges with open source sometimes. I mean, think even Firefox is open source, isn't it? So you use Firefox, you don't have I'm using it right now.
Or Chromium as well.
Chromium
WebKit
is, it's just that there's so much of it everywhere, and there's funny things. You see, I'm a bit philosophical, a bit almost political about it, I guess. But then it's funny, bring that up, because there's certain times when I was running a business. That's the thing. There's I've released a few modules for Drupal, but there's times when I want to write a piece of software and make money off it, and it's hard to make money off. Just and you see that in the WordPress game, right? That's where I'm not very familiar with WordPress, and I go in there, and I used that same example last week where I go to what's the commerce module for WordPress? Oh, look, there's like 10 of them. And here's the 4 best ones, and 3 of those are paid. And I'm like, hang on, you got to pay for a module? What? I'm like, it's just, and I go, just being in the Drupal world, it's interesting in the Drupal world how there's so much open source advocacy. Drupal's open source. If you wrote a Drupal module and you tried to monetize the Drupal module, you'd probably get a lot of pushback.
Well, there was talk about an app store, and my understanding was that there was a bit of a pushback because I believe generally the Drupal community isn't really for premium products.
Okay, but I find it seems a bit hypocritical when they also go, hey, the community's on Discord or Slack, and you're like, so you're happy for Slack and Discord to make money off us, but we're not allowed to make money off us. I just
But would you, okay, here's the question for you.
Yeah.
Would you pay for a premium Drupal module? Which is, because it has to be open source. It's still open source. The GPL, what is it, V2 license, I believe that's what Drupal's licensed under, doesn't prohibit you from making money. It just means that you get the same rights that I get. So would you pay a yearly fee to get some type of feature, but the module is still open source?
That's not necessarily true. If I wrote a module, that's not, as long as I don't use, like, it's only interfacing with Drupal's API, it's not touching any of Drupal's code. It's a standard. All the code in the module is its own code.
Yeah, but the code has to still be open source though.
No, you can close source a Drupal module. You probably can't host it on Drupal.org. I don't know, but yeah, like it's
Well,
the
somebody's
module
going to come
itself.
and
You can share that
somebody's going
module
to come.
without sharing any of Drupal's code with it. I don't see why you can't. Not that I'm saying we should, but it's an interesting conversation. Can you close source
Okay,
Drupal module?
generally, so let's take WordPress's ecosystem, because I'm very aware of WordPress.
Mm-hmm.
Because I pay for their plugins. I get access to their code base. Nothing's obfuscated, nothing's encrypted. I get access to the code base, and I pay for it. Now, I purely do that from a just because I don't want to spend the time doing it, building
Yep.
out that functionality. And honestly, I think Drupal is kind of missing out on that. Imagine if we had an ecosystem. Imagine if we had an ecosystem where developers could make a living selling Drupal modules.
Yeah, but as soon as you go, would you pay for it? I'm like, nah. Like that's
But
partly
why
why I don't
not?
use
Like,
WordPress. Rather go in there
the
and you
thing
go,
is,
what am I
though,
going to pay
if
for a
you
module?
but if it saves you a whole week of custom development, I would.
Yeah, see, but that takes me right back to when I was teenage years, and it's like, hey, I'm just a teenager. I want to build a website. I want to learn how to do it. How does that work with WordPress now? Like, you've got some 15-year-old kid with no money who wants to learn how to work with WordPress, and he's got to pay for the plugins to learn how
Well,
to
no,
use them.
there are free open source solutions to a lot of these things. If you want to use it. Okay, let's say, for example, you want to develop a course, and you want to promote and sell a course in WordPress. There's so many learning management system plugins out there that are paid for. And it's up to you. Do you want to build that functionality yourself? Do you want to handle subscriptions? Do you want to handle private groups and all that? Mind you, my experience with using one of the popular LMSs, so that's learning management system, so many times I was fighting against it.
Yeah.
And honestly, I thought, okay, if I spend I started paying $100, and then by the time I stopped paying for it, they kept increasing the prices to like $250, which is fair enough. Like, I understand if you're going to pay for something, they're going to increase the prices and not grandfather you in. But even I was like hitting a brick wall where I was like, this functionality, I could probably do this better myself in Drupal.
True.
Because I was consistently like, there was so much customization required that, yes, it gets you 80% there, but the last 20% takes you 80% of the time. And it's like, well, I might as well just build it from scratch.
It's interesting. You reminded me that I worked on a project once where we had a client's Drupal site that it was an existing site that the client came to us to work on, and they had a proprietary theme that they paid for. And they go, yeah, well, you've got to use this proprietary theme. We paid for it. And it was terrible. It had all sorts of bugs and stuff, and you couldn't do it. Like, you just had to work around them. I can't remember the logistics of that, but I remember running into these, you try and save the settings form and you get these horrible red errors all over the joint, try and upgrade it, and it just all sorts of issues. And I just remember going, like, on all the Drupal projects I've ever worked on, I've never had this much trouble with a theme. This is the only theme that I've ever seen anybody pay for. What's going on? Shouldn't the experience of paying for something make the experience better, not worse?
Well, that's it. Absolutely. Absolutely. That should be it. That you can just pay for it and you don't have to deal with it.
Yeah. So it's an interesting experience. And that's what I've stopped paying for PHP Storm at the moment, because I've got no need for it. I've not really been doing a lot of development work, or I've needed it in the recent times. And that's so, like, it was like the license came up. I go, well, I'm not actually doing any development right now. Why am I going to renew the license? Which is what's got me thinking about using VS Code and NeoVim. Like, I've got the time to sit down and play with it. But it's an interesting landscape. It's like the whole open source versus proprietary thing. And that's the point. Like, if I put a lot of effort in and had to hire developers and pay them to build something, I don't want to suddenly just give it give it away for free necessarily. So that kind of thing has been done. There are GitLab, for example, right? They got their community edition and their open source version of it. I don't know their history, but there's a business behind it. Ubuntu Canonical, right? From Ubuntu, Red Hat, right? They're all successful businesses that make money out of doing open source stuff. But I mean, that's a conversation. Anybody familiar with open source has had this conversation before. We were going to talk about what sort of tools we use, because we do use, like, that's, talking about, I'm using KDE Live to do my video editing, which that's another one that's given me the pains, because Adobe comes with things like automatically removing silences. And now with AI, they've got all their AI stuff plugged in to help you edit it and speed up the editing process. And here I am doing a lot of that work manually. Quite amazed that I can just download an open source editing tool and and do what I do with that. And it works very much the same. It's the same experience, apart from there's little polishes that I'd expect to get from something like Premiere Pro, right? But then, is Premiere Pro going to run on my Linux box? So then I got to buy, right? It's just, right. So, but then you've got things like DaVinci Resolve, and at the moment I've had trouble running that because my graphics card's too old. I mean, that's a big advantage of open source right there. I've got old hardware, an old video card, download KDE Live, do the editing. I can edit this podcast fine. I get the job done. It's great. On old hardware, haven't paid a dime. Thanks, KDE Live. Wouldn't it be nice if there was lots of titles and stuff and more help? Because you go on to YouTube to get help on KDE Live, and you literally search for help on KDE Live, and half your search results are telling you how to do it in DaVinci and Adobe, and you're like, because it's just there's the pros and cons, right? That's the tool I have access to given the resources I'm using at the moment. But then I lose all that. There is the disadvantage of, there's an advantage to using the tools that everybody else uses.
Yeah.
I had the same argument we were on a few projects where the organization I was working for, the sysadmin department, had dictated we're going to use Postgres. All our projects are going to use Postgres. No word about it. End of story. The reason, I believe, was because they could run Postgres as a service in AWS and just click a button and up it was. Otherwise, they'd have to manage MySQL themselves. But that decision got passed down the line. Then I hear I'm running Drupal, and then you run into a bug that's Postgres only, and you're like, go on the internet, you go, and there's no, I'm the first, because not many people are using Postgres in Drupal. So, hey, guess who's solving that problem all by themselves, right? It's kind of, there's a real big advantage to using what everybody else uses, because other people have hit the roadblocks before you a lot of the time. Right? But then that's not just always that's not just an open source thing, right? Because like, look at Drupal. The big advantage of Drupal is it comes with the community.
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite of that problem.
And that's huge. The fact that it's open source, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. When you search for things, you can find information about it. People talk about it. And that's very important. It just helps with figuring things out. But coming back to the whole PHP Storm thing, I love how, I don't know why, but people either love PHP Storm or absolutely hate it because you have to pay for it. I've got a few friends, Drupal devs, that are always trying to convince me, use VS Code, just install this, this, and this to get this plugin to work. And but you need to get the premium version of that IntelliSense for PHP. And well, when you think about it, the cost of there is one plugin for VS Code that gives you good IntelliSense for PHP, and it's like a one-off license. So when you think about it, the cost is, for a person working in the industry, is pretty minimal.
Not the opposite. Sorry, it was funny. I was complaining about in PHP Storm, you've got all these open source plugins for PHP Storm. And
and now it's
open source, and you've got proprietary plugins.
Exactly. But the thing is, though, I like PHP Storm. I don't mind it. It does the job. Is it perfect? No. Does it use up a ton of RAM? Yes. I actually had just last week I don't know, for some reason, it ran out of RAM on my machine. And I've got, how much do I have? I've got 32 gig of RAM. It's like it ran out of RAM because there must have been something, and I just shut it down. It's happened like once or twice. But mind you, Docker was using up 10 gig.
VS Code uses the stack too, right?
Oh yeah, it
From
does.
what I've heard,
But I
I haven't
mean,
used it very much.
but when you're using Docker, when you're using PHP Storm, when you're using Chrome, yeah, those things are just memory hogs.
Well, I've got
And
rid
it
of
ran
Chrome
out.
off my. I couldn't run Chrome anymore. I uninstalled it because every time I use it, it's using up all my memory. I'm like, this is ridiculous. Goodbye, Firefox. It is. You know, I'm not a huge fan. If there's reasons, I'd rather not use. Like there's better, more open sourcey browsers.
Yeah.
But there is this payoff. Sometimes you just like the tool's too much of a pain in the butt to use. Then you got to use what works. So I say the same thing about like I'd love to have a Linux phone, but nah.
Yeah.
Like it's expensive, and then not only is it expensive, it's not as usable for doing what I do. I want to have access to YouTube and Facebook and those things. I need access to those things to communicate with people and stuff. And it's one of the things that just annoys me that often it's just, hey, I don't like sometimes that Linux gets that bad name. So I don't like Linux because it can't run Adobe Photoshop kind of argument. That's not Linux's fault. That's Adobe's fault. You should not like Adobe for that.
Yeah.
I don't, it's my sense of fairness, I think, that I get a bit. It's like, that's not fair, criticizing Linux because Adobe won't run on it. That's Adobe's fault. They're interesting. I mean, it's a fair argument. It's a good, it's kind of like, if you need to use Adobe Photoshop, then you can't use Linux, fine. But don't poo-poo Linux for that. That's put the, well, Linux should do better. Linux can't do anything about that.
Well, exactly.
Set back wine. I wonder how it goes under wine these days. I have no idea. But, there is GIMP. You can use GIMP. I used GIMP for years. Over the years, being a web developer, every once in a while you got a job where you got to do a bit of graphic stuff for some reason. Way before Drupal days, remember the web develop, that's kind of web development before I got into Drupal and became like a Drupal backend person. A web developer was a jack of all trades. You cut up in, someone sends you a big Photoshop file, you got to take all the images out, you got to cut them up, you got to, even little small jobs, you're often designing logos and stuff just because your boss has sold some $1,000 jobby website. We're going to build a website for $1,000. Here you go. Build it. No, I've got to do everything from scratch. Over the years, become more specialist, and it's like, it's interesting how that's gone from, being that jack of all trades, building little $1,000 websites, to being a Drupal backend developer where you got a big Drupal project and you're integrating it with all these awesome systems, pulling data in from APIs and pulling that into the database and doing syncing and storing it in all this. Sucking in data and storing it in tables and finding views and ways to display data from a back-end system and triggers and all sorts of. Drupal's quite fun, but it's interesting how it moved from that, building those little cheapy websites to one day it's like, wow, I'm working on like multi-million-dollar websites on an open source platform. PHP being open source. As open source, you're working on Linux. I'm sitting here, of course, working at an open source organization for years. The whole organization, just everybody had pretty much an Ubuntu. You were allowed to use whatever kind of Linux desktop you wanted, but it was kind of sudo use Ubuntu because that's what everyone uses. And if you want help, it's kind of what the rule would pretty much was. You can use what you want, but if you want us to help you, then you got to use Ubuntu. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Because that's what everyone else is using. And then, literally running a multinational organization. We had the Australian branch of that, the New Zealand branch. Linux everywhere. There was 250 staff when I left. Linux across the board. So you got Linux on the desktop, Linux running that. You're using PHP. You're building Drupal websites. It's just open source all the way through, and it just makes you go a bit. It's a proprietary thing. There's so many places where it's, and I do all these arguments, but then I recognize my own bias because it's like, well, if I wanted to build a big piece of software, I've had ideas for things I want to build, of course. I want to build it as a service and have memberships and have people access it. It's either I sell advertising and host it and do that. Okay, it's open source, but I'm going to do the hosting sort of thing. Or you just close source it and go pay me a subscription fee and you don't get access to it. And that's probably the way I'd want to go. Of course, I need to eat, right? And open source is risky. So,
that's it.
Yeah. So, proprietary tools. we've talked about
Yes.
PHP Storm,
Yes.
and Adobe Premiere and KDN Live. You've used a lot more because you've moved over to Apple and Mac. I'm not a
Yes.
Apple user either. I've stayed away for the same reason, and I find them expensive. Apple Silicon's great. You go, yeah, but look at the iPhone, for example. Look at the equivalent kind of, Chinese brand. I don't like Chinese brands either, but you get an Android phone equivalent to an iPhone. The difference is like $400 versus $1,700 to the Apple, and then Macs. They might, but it's kind of like I feel like you're paying like what 300% more for 10% better.
Well, yeah, true. But even if you get a high-end Android phone, you're paying similar prices to a iPhone. Back in the day, that's what got me off iPhones. Just the cost of them. It was like, I can't justify spending that much when I can get the equivalent of an Android phone, and I was happy with it. But then I wanted to get a good Android phone with a decent camera. As soon as you do that, then you're paying iPhone prices. And so
I was researching this recently, given the content creation things we're into. And that's where I saw this the other day, going the best phones of 2024 for content creation. And you had obviously one of the iPhones up there, $1,700.
Yeah.
And then there was like one of the Google phones for the next one. And then they go the best value, the best bang for the buck. And you looked at the stats, and they're like, look, it's pretty much just as good. It was like $400. And you're just
which
like,
phone was this? Like Motorola or something? Was it a Motorola?
It was a Chinese brand, Xiaomi or something along those lines, and then there's all sorts of questions around using Chinese company phones as well. I mean, when you're caring about privacy? I mean, I do that. I find myself a bit hypocritical. I care about privacy to an extent. I don't like the companies that spy. I don't like that Google and Microsoft and Apple all doing that spying and stuff.
Well, yeah.
On the other hand, the convenience is hard to, but then I find myself getting cranky at the rest of the world, because if all you lot weren't using bloody Apple and Google iPhone, then I wouldn't have to, right? It's a bit of, I can get quite antsy about it sometimes too. It's like, just if you lot stop selling your soul to these big companies that are giving you then, it's like kind of, and if I want to go against that, then it's kind of like, I feel like it's almost an analogy in my head of, here's this nice little castle with these nice little walls, and you got this rich king that's just giving you all these scraps of stuff, and you get to stay within the walls. And then, but I don't like that king, so I want to get out, which means I've got to get out of the walls, and I'm out on my own. But it's like, if you just came with me, then we'd all be out there together and have that power to work. Like, it's kind of, I just like, you like just staying in there in your cozy little room where it's not so bad outside. It's not that bad outside. It's okay, but it's just lonely. Right? And it's a little bit, that's kind of how I feel about it, especially Apple, because once you get an Apple ecosystem, you see them play those games. The EU goes, hey, you've got to, change your Lightning to use USB. Was it USB-C?
Yeah.
Right. And then they just find their loophole, how they can make it, and they fight it, and they want to. And it's interesting that argument, and it's a fairly valid one, that they can get that standard and everything interoperates, and they've got full control, and they can, innovate, right? And it's funny, it's an interesting argument. But like, because we keep the control, we can innovate better. But then look at open source. The amount of innovation that happens in open source is just amazing.
Yeah.
But then that's one of the things that Linux really that there's too much choice. There's way too much choice, which is why sort of, in the desktop, you ended up having two come out in front with GNOME and KDE, and you basically had Ubuntu, Debian, and Fedora. Made it easy. So you don't even, the desktop's the only one that the end user really cares about. So they're your basic choices, which made it easier. That helped to get in the desktop. So just put Ubuntu on it and use whatever it comes with. It'll do, and that's where Canonical really made a huge big difference. They made it easy to take that choice down. You see the same now with Docker. Like, you've got DDev, Lando, you've got Docker options, Docker on the desktop. There's all sorts of other stacks. Other tools around that. It's just, there's so many tools, and that's where open source. It's great that it gives you choice, but it's like, I think there's something about human nature, and there's too much. And I've heard people almost make this exact argument. I just want something that just works. And I think a
Yes.
lot of the time what they mean is I don't want to have to think about it to make a choice. Just you know, just give me, it's easy. Apple or Windows, okay, cool. I've got my computer. You know, as soon as Linux comes along, even though you can just put Ubuntu on it, it's like, but what's Ubuntu? Oh, and there's KDE and there's all these other ones and there's all that, and you can configure it and you can configure everything. You can change it all if you want. They're like, wow, I'm overloaded. And I think open source has that problem, the problem of too much choice. Sometimes I do that speech. I think I start to sound like that villain because I want to say people like to be controlled. We've had a good discussion about the proprietary stuff.
Yes, we have.
We've got other things down here. What do we got? We've talked JetBrains, PX, Windows, Mac OS, Adobe, but they're really the big ones, right? When it comes to proprietary, I haven't used Windows for years. Like I kind of installed Wine on my machine and go, what tools have I been missing out on? And I just couldn't come up with anything, right? I installed Wine and it's like, there's nothing I want to install.
But I think people just need to be aware of a lot, you know, the SaaS ecosystem as well. Oh, that's proprietary.
Yes.
You are locked in. So yeah, you can say, because when you were mentioning about, you know, a lot of these Adobe products aren't available, but a lot of people now do not use these desktop-based applications. They would use Google Workspace. They will use Microsoft 365. They'll use Canva for video and graphics. I know for me personally, I only use Premiere Pro for like just for the final part of the video production. But you could easily run a lot of your business off these SaaS applications, which in a way you're still locked in. And yeah, you can use Linux, and you can go ahead and use Linux on the desktop if everything is done through a browser.
Yeah, well, that's
kind of get away with that.
That is a lot of my life. I use Canva.
Yeah.
I use the Google suite of, you know, I haven't had to use Microsoft spreadsheets for ages, but I've just traded in Microsoft for Google. Yeah. Google Sheets, Google's, it's just called Documents, you know, like
or
that.
Docs, Google Docs.
Yeah, Docs. I've been using that for years. Google Drive. And Gmail, it's all in the browser.
Yeah.
The convenience, but yeah, that is all proprietary stuff running where it's for free. And that's the difference between but you say it's for free, but you're trading all your data. You know, that is
absolutely.
You're trading your data. I mean, I had a machine. I set up Nextcloud on a machine there for a while, but then I had to move, and I had that running at home on a box on the floor. But I've got a VPS that I haven't got around to installing Nextcloud on, but it's something that I've very seriously considered going. I kind of want to get away from Google, and it's so much work, right? It's kind of,
well, that's it.
I've got my list of all my to-do items, and every day it just gets pushed down the line because it's just going to take so much time. And the same as it's exactly like changing from PHP Storm to VS Code. There's a learning curve. It's uncomfortable. It's like trying to learn to type with Dvorak instead of QWERTY. It's hard. You got to get over that hump and get that adjustment. And so I'm trapped in there in that sense. Like I philosophically don't like using Google stuff. And then I know my own hypocrisy because it's like, well, if I built that thing, I'd want people to pay for it too, right?
Yeah.
But these different worlds, I mean, because we're right at the end coming up here, but I did want to pick your brain a bit because I know I've struggled a bit by being so open sourcey that I use Vim for years and I'm quite happy doing it. But there are those times where it's like, I've just said it before, Discord being proprietary, I prefer not to use it. I don't like using Slack. You got to bite the bullet sometimes. And it's not like, I've got to pay to use Slack. They offer it, Drupal's getting that to use for free. You don't have to pay. I don't know how Discord makes money. No idea.
Well, Slack has been nice to give the Drupal community, and I found this out at Drupal South, has given the Drupal community, I think, a premium version. So we have access to all historical chat messages, because on the free version, I believe it's only the last 10,000, or maybe they changed that.
I don't know. I thought someone sponsored it.
Slack, but they can pull it out anytime, and they can just say, no more, and then all of a sudden all your historical content is gone. So there was a question, because we actually did have, and this is a bit of a shameless plug for Drupal South, but we did have Dries, who is the project founder, and also the CEO of the Drupal Association was there as well. And there was a panel. And that was one of the questions about, is there a discussion about moving off Slack? Purely because Slack is used, like, to be fair, Slack is quick and easy. Everyone knows how to use it. I think it's been the de facto chat tool other than Teams.
That wins in so many options.
Exactly. I probably used IRC for a bit. I just found it too difficult to use. And I just use Slack because I had it already open up. But one of the questions was, what happens when Slack, stops giving the community the premium version or the paid for version. So there is a discussion about that happening, but I'm not sure where it's at.
Yeah, I know that the discussions come up. I've seen the discussion in Slack go about how about we move to Rocket Chat. Some people have set some up. There's all the challenges with who's gonna manage it and maintain it, right? Same thing happened with moving to GitLab. It's not free, right? That's the thing with open source. It might be the software itself is free, but then you've got to hope that's Google Docs. It's just, there it is, go on use Google Docs. Great. They're paid for it. They've covered it. Yeah, we'll keep your data. We've got access to it. We can take it away anytime we like, blah, blah, blah. If I want to go set up Nextcloud, I've got to go and host that. I've got to worry about the security. I've got to worry about the updates.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Even that's just me on a personal level. You go to running something like Drupal with so many people and so many people relying on that. I know that's one of the reasons why they've gone, look, just use Slack. That is one of the big considerations. I often look at it like Drupal being an open source tool. There's so many people that care about open source. I'm not the only one. I know there are other people that agree with me. I've seen them say so around the mills. But then at some point, you just got to cut your losses. But, it's a funny thing. We're using PHP. So I'm running on Linux. I'm running on PHP. I'm building a Drupal because I'm an open source person, but then you're pushing me to use Slack because that's where I either use Slack or I don't get help.
Yes.
PHP Storm went the same way. I got pressured, right? So right now I'm using PHP Storm. I like when VS Code came out and was open sourced. I found it clunky. I didn't quite enjoy it. So we've pretty much covered it all, though, haven't we?
I think so.
There's our big open source versus proprietary discussion. Yeah. All sorts of crazy stuff.
Exactly. And do please leave a comment if you do have any opinions that differ to ours, or of a great open source project that's not tech focused. I always like finding those ones that aren't really tech focused that people use. Like Anki is one of them, where developers wouldn't really be using that unless they want to do flashcard based learning or timed repetition learning, like I've been doing.
There's other things like open source. Didn't someone make like an open source collar? It's not even just code or software or stuff. You can.
It can be hardware as well.
Yeah. So we've come to the end. I guess we're going to wrap it up. And thanks for hanging around.
All right. Cool.
See you later.
All right. See you later.